Tyla and Douglas Gabriel here for the American Intelligence Media and a whole lot of other platforms I don't have time to go through. But if you look at your screen, you'll see some of the links that you might want to follow to get more information on what Douglas is going to share with you today. So how this all started is a shout out to AIMCAT at Private Lee 1776. He's on Gab, and assuming it's a he, it could be a she, or maybe a they, who knows. But the question was, might you lend an ear here regarding Mike Flynn, General USA retired, comments last Friday morning. Words were not clear, but here's a recording. Flynn's prayer, quote, "We are your instruments of the seven rays," and on he goes, legions, all of them. What is he referring to? So, of course, we turned to our in-house guru, Obi-Wan Kenobi, Douglas Gabriel. What do you make of this?
Well, he called it the sevenfold rays. Now, when you told me this, and I saw the film and him say this, and later he did refer to all the archangels and the legions, it immediately reminded me of one of two things. Either that he would be a student of Alice Bailey, who wrote a book called Treatise on the Seven Rays, and believed that these seven rays were, each ray was controlled by a ascended master being, El Moria, Dualkul, Kutumi, Paul the Venetian, Seraphis Bey, Hilarion, Saint Germain, and Jesus Christ. Well, I really don't think, and I'm sorry, I may be quite disparaging in some of my remarks today, and I apologize for it. And by the way, I have talked about this before because Tyla made me talk about it because it's another interesting chapter in my biography.
Right. Let me just say, talking over you, sorry, inside the, or look at, if you're listening to this on YouTube or some other video platform, look at the thumbnail and you're going to see the site where you will find more information. What I've done is I've put the articles that we previously wrote on Saint Germain. We wrote these back in 2016 because I wanted to memorialize Douglas's contacts with Clare and Mark Prophet, and that story unfolded into Saint Germain. And the punchline, of course, is, remember that time that Saint Germain came for tea?
Yeah.
Well, it wasn't Mike Flynn,
That's
but
right.
you're gonna. But tell us about this backstory of the prophets.
Oh my. Well, let's. I'm going to first talk about Alice Bailey. To talk about Alice Bailey, you have to talk about Helena Petrovna Blavatsky, the founder in 1875 of Theosophy here in America. And she had come over to be with the Fox sisters and all these spiritualists who were doing table knocking and all this stuff. And she was a very gifted clairvoyant. As a matter of fact, they said that she could contact the ascended masters, some of the same masters that I just mentioned that Alice Bailey puts into her treatise on the seven rays. And to begin with, I would just want to say, General Flynn, okay, there's no such thing as a general that isn't a murderer. And now you can do it under the auspices of war, saying that your side is right. But basically, you order people to their death and you create death. And I don't know a general who's very smart. You can't be very smart and participate in wars that are created by false flags under false pretenses, like weapons of mass destruction. You can't go out and participate in the military as a general without having some really bad karma and not having a very effective thinking brain. And so I just want to say, to begin with, he's not a smart character. But when he said sevenfold rays, that can only be referring to Alice Bailey or to Elizabeth Clare Prophet. And I will describe both of those streams right now. Alice Bailey was a follower of Helena Petrovna Blavatsky. And in about 1922, she started to write books that were a reflection of Blavatsky. Now, Blavatsky was a person who they said was one of the greatest clairvoyants of all times. She could manifest things called apport. They drop out of the air in front of her. Knockings. Oh no, the table knockings of the spiritualists was nothing One time someone came into her room and asked her if she could manifest knockings, and his glasses started having knockings on the inside until they fell off of his head, and then knockings on all around the room, not only the doors, the walls, the ceilings, the floor, all started knocking so loud he was terrified. Blavatsky had the capacity. She traveled all over the world as a woman. She even fought with Garibaldi, and no one knew she was a woman. She had astounding capacities, one of the greatest memories of all times. She had more than a photographic memory. She could supposedly go to the Akashic records and read sacred texts that she had never held in her hand. And she could quote them verbatim. And when you went and looked, you found that her quotes were correct. She wrote The Secret Doctrine, The Secret Doctrine, without a library. The same thing with Isis Unveiled, two of the greatest, amazing compendiums of Eastern wisdom. But she was not into Christ. So she didn't understand Jesus Christ, whether as an ascended master or master or anything. Plus, we had, at some point to try to clarify this, wrote a series of articles called Masters and Avatars. And in there, you'll hear true historical descriptions of the Comte de Saint Germain, and all these different masters are all spelled out for you to get the lay of the land. But Blavatsky supposedly would be able to do apportations where she would draw pictures of the masters. She claimed to have known Master Kutumi, Master El Moria, Master Seraphis Bey, all these different masters. Well, that created a furor at her time that led to some of the crazy, absolute cultish nonsense that goes on to this day. But in between, there were amazing psychics and clairvoyants who came forward who demonstrated capacities that have yet to be explained even to this day. So after Blavatsky, there was a man called Bayard Spalding, who wrote a series of 6 books called The Life and Teachings of the Masters of the Far East. He claimed in 1894 to have traveled to Tibet with 10 other people, and they met these masters up in the mountains who could sit in a cave and not eat for years at a time and melt the snow that they were sitting on with sitting there practically naked. And so he made all these astounding claims. Now, of course, I've read all these books because I, studied comparative religions, and these cults, even these religious cults, as it were, or cults just per se. So basically, they were found to be a fraud, and he never traveled there. Blavatsky claimed that she had met in Tibet, Tibetan masters, like basically the Panchen Lama and the teachers of the Dalai Lama and all these different people. But she never traveled to Tibet. She traveled all over the world, but she did not go to Tibet. So when she claims that she knew these Tibetan masters, sometimes she would say that they came to visit her when she was in England, or they came to visit here or there. But when it comes down to it, the master she was really referring to was Louis Mailander, who was an illiterate man in Kempten, Germany, who many great people went and studied with. Some of the great occultists and great Freemasons of their time went and studied with this person, and he was considered to be the reincarnation of St. John. Well, all of these things are highly spurious. Now, there are writings by these people, and I have acquired these writings. The Mailander gave out some teachings, and a guy named Krebs wrote them down, and Weinfurter and all these other people who were Eckstein and all these people connected to them, to this master teacher in Germany. But in fact, when it comes down to it, there was no proof of this. And later on, Blavatsky was tested by people and found to be a fraud, a charlatan. And she moved then from England to Adyar, India, the headquarters of the Theosophical Society, the Eastern branch, and lived there and was very close friends with Maria Montessori, as a matter of fact. And Annie Besant, when Blavatsky died, took her place, and she claimed to be able to speak to the masters. Well, this is, of course, all extremely spurious. Bayard Spalding, again, he set into motion this furor, this absolute crazy tendency that everyone then had to authenticate their clairvoyant experience of their own, in general, I would say, their attempt to contact their higher self, but they then had to authenticate it by stating that they were inspired by some master. So Alice Bailey came along, and when you look at her works, the Treatise on Cosmic Fire, I believe, was after she read the Isis Unveiled and Secret Doctrine, she basically synthesized it in a very digestible, almost cartoonish-like form, and she wrote a whole bunch of books. Of course, I've read all of them, and the one that I believe that Flynn was making reference to was either the Treatise on the Seven Rays or other books on the rays, and there was a bunch of them that Alice Bailey wrote. Now, as a strange historical note, in the United Nations, the source of evil in the world, at 666 United Nations Plaza, Alice Bailey created a publishing company called Lucifer Publishing. And her husband, Paul Foster Case, who also wrote books, became such a big deal in the United Nations that there are no religions acknowledged by the United Nations, because it's, a conglomerate of all different religions and peoples and nations. But the only place you can go to pray is donated by the Lucius Trust. Lucius is just another name for Lucifer, and it's a meditation room. And Paul Foster Case and Alice Bailey were the inspirers of that.
But wait a minute. But General Flynn, with his influence and his position on the national stage, what is he doing? Is he calling in demons into this earth plane with reference to this?
If he is a follower of Alice Bailey, if he's done any homework, and I really don't think he's smart enough to, I think he gets a lot of...
He look like a very bright person. In fact, so many of our generals, think about Miley, and all of them have themselves been brainwashed, or they are actual enemies of America, which we have claimed that General Flynn is such, and that he perhaps has been an integral part of the overthrow attempt of Donald Trump, coming from the British Pilgrims led by Sir Richard Dearlove and others. Just an aside. So this quote, we're going to keep going. I know that for many people that you are getting weedy, but you got to hang in there, folks, because this will all make sense when Douglas has wrapped it up.
General Flynn's son is the one who brought to Trump the day that he held up this piece of paper that said it came from Before It's News. And it was extremely spurious, wild, crazy speculation. Well, General Flynn and his son, who was part of his consulting company after he got fired by the Obama administration and had to leave the National Security Council, I believe certainly do dabble in very spurious activities. And to demonstrate that he's not smart at all, he's, matter of fact, I would call an idiot, he started to work for the Russians on their Russian-American station here. And then he actually went to Russia to receive an award from that company. He also worked for Erdogan, and he got fired by Obama because he was supporting Erdogan and the Syrian war. And of course, Obama wanted the Syrian war to go on with Bashar al-Assad, and who actually called a strike down on his own people so that the United Nations would give him refugee funds, as those refugees, 800,000 of them, at first, bombed by their own president, went across the border to Turkey, where Erdogan then started receiving his refugee funds. So this is who, after having a top secret security clearance and a top general, he started to work for the enemy without ever claiming as being an agent of a foreign power. Well, you would have to be an idiot to do that. So I'm not exaggerating when I say he is an idiot.
Okay, well, let's get back on track now. So he has come out on the public platform and he has called upon these demons from Alice Bailey days. I mean, when you say that, I think about the times of Aleister Crowley and Barbara Bush giving birth to the demon spawn and all those kinds of things. And W.T. Stead, or is it W.P. Stead? I can't remember. And all of that's coming here from the 1920s and 30s on up here. So why is General Flynn calling upon this? And continue on and tell us about the relationship with Lighthouse Summit.
Yes. Well, first off, Flynn is making the rounds in the fundamentalist churches, and then they have him pray at the end, and he lets slip, calling it the sevenfold rays. That was just showing who he truly is. Weak-minded people use seances and pseudo clairvoyants and psychics who are many times charlatans to substantiate what it is that they want. For instance, as you just mentioned, W.T. Stead was a spiritualist, did many seances with Cecil Rhodes and the people who basically have constructed the British imperialistic corporate nation that is behind all that we see in today's evil. Now, going back, imagine that you are quoting the sevenfold rays, and by the way, Summit Lighthouse is an extrapolation of Bayard Spalding, Alice Bailey, and Mark Prophet, and Keith Reinhardt, who I'm going to that is really the chain of people who created these phenomena that led to the belief that you can tap into these seven rays, and when you do, you go through a master being like Moria, and that master being has a certain color and a certain philosophy and a certain stone, a crystal stone or some type of stone that is connected. So there's these correspondences that absolutely seem as if they are real because there's so many details to them, but they're not. Now, are there ascended masters? Of course there are. Do they come and appear through clairvoyants who sit in their what's called a prayer cabinet or their seance cabinet, like Keith Reinhardt did, who was the most tested psychic clairvoyant of all times? No, they don't. They come to your heart and they speak to the heart, but they actually do manifest as in physical incarnations, and they are here to help humanity, but they're almost always behind the scenes. You do not, like the Comte de Saint Germain. He went to all the nations. He was the deposed ruler of Transylvania, the Rakovsky House, and wherever he went, he helped that nation with whatever problems they had because he had such brilliance that he could do amazing things. For instance, in France, he took the jewels of Marie Antoinette and put them through a process, which we now know is simply heating them in a very slow oven. And you can purify because the inclusions in a crystal are actually water vapor. And if you heat them properly and not too much, you can make them become more clear. So that is why the association with all these stones is connected to Saint Germain. So what is Flynn saying? He's trying to reach the fundamentalists, go to all these churches to try to beef up support for Trump, when in fact, we shouldn't be listening to him at all. He's the idiot who literally did talk about improper things before he came to power with the Trump team. And of course, Mike Pence, Judas, what do you call him? 30
I call
pence?
him Judas 30 pence. But I have a
Turned him in.
question. Because it's also discussed among these circles that Saint Germain was around when during the American First Revolution.
Yes. There was a person who appeared in the room out of nowhere, spoke to the founding fathers, and when they turned around, he was gone. So,
don't change the subject, because when I saw Flynn up there doing this, I had an intuition that where he is going to start insinuating that he is the reincarnated Saint Germain.
It could be. And Saint Germain was a real person, and he renovated the Freemasonic rites through the Seven Muses Lodge in Paris, where Benjamin Franklin even associated with them. And remember, the Freemasons are directly connected to politics, to Washington, D.C., the Scottish Rite headquarters, it's called the Temple, the Sacred Temple of the Scottish Rite. It's called the Herodome, is right there, next to the Capitol building. So Masonry has a lot of connections to these things also, and Saint Germain was one of the most important Freemasons of all time.
But we would expect for anyone who wanted to question whether this was the truth or not, you would expect that if Saint Germain were reincarnated today in a physical form behind the scenes, he would be someone of utter brilliance.
Absolutely.
He would be able to connect the dots throughout all history.
As Christ said, you know them by their fruits. Saint Germain was such a masterful musician that today his compositions, which he did when he was in England, still stand as some of the greatest pieces of music ever written. His book, Most Holy Trinity Sophia, is one of the most profound documents I've ever read. But he had expertise in all areas, and he was truly a master being. Now, when we say Saint Germain, it's a Le Comte de Saint Germain, and he isn't a saint. He was never made a saint by the Catholic Church. He was the opposite. Freemasonry was an attempt to undermine the papacy and the Vatican instead of put forward those ideas. And certainly the true Saint Germain would be talking about Christ, the true Christ, not just Jesus of Nazareth, but Jesus the Christ, and pointing out that that Christ and being is in every human heart if they accept that and they develop it on the path of ascension. So, going back, Alice Bailey wrote some very cool books. In the old days, when you walked in somebody's house, you used to go up to their library and you looked at the books that they had, and you could tell all about them, what they thought, and so on and so forth. And I did a lot of traveling when I was young. And if people had the whole set of Alice Bailey, you could have a conversation with them from now till the cows come home, because there's so much content in it, because it was really a digested and synthesized version of what Blavatsky was doing, but it added Christianity, and is quite amazing. Then came along a person named Keith Milton Reinhardt, who in 1955 created the Aquarian Foundation Church, or what he called the Church of Tomorrow Today. He wrote books like, let's see, what's the name of it? The Art of Becoming a Master. And he sometimes called himself all kinds of names. One of them was Master Emil, but he said that he channeled Master Odessa to write that book. And he wrote many, many things. And he filmed these performances, you would call them, in Seattle, where the Aquarian Foundation Church was located. And he was the most tested clairvoyant psychic of all times. He would sit in a chair inside of a cabinet, draw the curtain, and then when he opened it, even with the full lights on and with cameras rolling, and after police had frisked him and tried to find out if there was any charlatanry going on, he was not a charlatan per se, but I think at the end he was. But basically, he could manifest crystals out his mouth. Now, some would say he regurgitated them. So then he started having them come out his eyes and his hands, or that he would close the curtain after it had been examined, his little cabinet, and 50 stones and Roman coins and ivory from India would all at once just fall down, and they would take them and examine them, and they would be real. Things that he didn't have. He was a young boy when he started all this. He started his clairvoyant activity when he was in high school. Well, he continued on. I got a chance to meet him 2 different times, and he traveled all over the world, and 40 different nations, and 20 of those nations, they tested him. And in Japan, they created what they thought was a foolproof chair that he would sit in to make sure that he did not move or anything else, that there could be no trickery, and he still was able to manifest these things. He also had ectoplasm come out his eyes, his nose, his ears, his face, and it would form into a hand, pick up a pen in being filmed. I've seen these films, and they would write or draw a picture. And sometimes the pictures were amazing that you would say, wait, no one could have done that quickly.
Do you think you could get some of those hands manifested to help me with dinner tonight?
Yeah, no kidding. If he could have just been practical with it. But Blavatsky did the same thing. She would manifest letters from the masters. She would go into her cabinet and come out with a picture of the master Kutumi. She would have voices speak through her. They recorded and filmed Keith Milton Reinhardt, and they tested the voices of them on modern equipment and found that they were different voices. And he said that he had all of the masters I've mentioned, and then some, speaking through him, and he would also speak for the dead. So if you were part of his church and you paid a whole lot of money to go into a private session with him, when you would come up to his cabinet and the curtain would be pulled aside, you'd look inside and you'd see someone who you knew who had passed on, and they would give you a message. Okay, so Keith Reinhardt was the inspiration for Mark Prophet, who was the husband of Elizabeth Clare Prophet after he left his wife and 5 children and picked her up on a street corner, literally. And she created she went on with Mark Prophet's Summit Lighthouse, and then she created the Church Universal and Triumphant. Like I said, I had a couple chances to meet her, and she asked me to join her organization and work with her, but of course I turned her down because she was a charlatan. Now, all of these people only can go forward when they have philanthropic sponsors. Well, when I was 19, I came across a person who gave me all of the writings of Keith Reinhardt and Mark Prophet. And Mark Prophet, after he wrote Climb the Highest Mountain and The Retreats of the Masters, produced all these lessons. And in those days, just like they were before, previously, these psychic groups, you'd have to join them, pay a bunch of money to join, and then every time you got a lesson, you had to pay for the lesson. So I got the stack, literally, probably 3 feet tall, of someone who had gotten all of these from the major sponsor of Keith, Milton Reinhardt, and Mark Prophet. So she said, I want you to meet this woman who's their sponsor. And I said, well, first I want to read all these things. So I dove into them and I read all of them. And it was, a bunch of nice, silly, kind of, and oftentimes goofy spiritual stuff, claiming to be directly from the masters. So I read all of that. And then I got the chance to meet a lady who was one of the wealthiest families in Wilmington, North Carolina, the Bellamy family. Her name was Ellen. And she had a mansion on an island in the Cape Fear River, as well as a huge mansion in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. So I would go to those places and meet with this woman. And she, at that point, it was 1973 or 4, Mark Prophet had just died. And she hated Elizabeth Clare Prophet. She knew she was just a tramp, basically. And when she started going back and putting her name on all the books, saying that she helped Mark Prophet write these books. No, that's not true. He was an old man. She was a young person, and Mark had written them long before on the basis of Alice Bailey's connections with the 7 rays, the sevenfold rays, and the Bayard, Spalding, and Helena Petrovna Blavatsky. So they all basically tapped into the same type of wisdom. I was extremely impressed when I read Mark Prophet's book, Climb the Highest Mountain, and very impressed because I was young at the plethora of work produced by Keith Reinhardt and by Mark Prophet. So this lady showed me, we became very good friends over the years, and she showed me these stones that would pop out of Keith Reinhardt's mouth. She said, I was there when this popped out of his eye. And I'd look at it, and I had the ability at that time, because I had certain, what you'd call psychic gifts. I could touch a stone.
Blah, blah, blah. You used to be clairvoyant. You're not anymore. And I would say, no, that's not the case. I've seen you activate your clairvoyance way too many times, Douglas, for you to keep saying that you don't have this ability. Maybe it was different back then, but.
I was from Missouri, and I went down to Arkansas, and I was totally into quartz crystals and all these stones and stuff. And I could take a stone, touch it to my teeth, and tell you whether it's glass or it's real. I don't know to this day why that works, but it does. And so I would, I would test these. She had whole boxes of them, literally. She paid millions of dollars to be his top student and be there again and again and again, many, many, many times when he would go into these trances. They were filmed. There were many, many films, but only the rich people got to have the films, and only the rich people who donated to him got the inner track. And later, Keith Reinhardt went down to Arkansas and bought these 500-pound crystal stones, crystal quartz clusters, and put them in his Aquarian Foundation churches in the different places in America that they were, and also overseas in other countries. So this lady, Ellen, showed me all of this, showed me these films. They spooked me out. And then she says, listen, I want you to meet Keith Reinhardt. So at that point, I did not meet him. I just looked at all these things. But she said, and now Mark Prophet's wife, Elizabeth Clare Prophet, I want you to meet her. So she came to the mansion there in Wilmington, and I met her, and I was extraordinarily unimpressed. I could tell she was a complete fake. She didn't have a psychic bone in her body. Now, Keith Reinhardt, on the other hand, was so well known throughout the world for this because he was so flamboyant, and he would invite people in. He'd invite the police in to come and search his body, and they weighed his body before he would manifest these stones, before and after, down to the minuscule amounts, and his body weight wouldn't change. The ectoplasm was very real. There was no way you could fake this. So, but there have been many psychics who could produce ectoplasm. That's basically your etheric body just coming out because you go into a very, very deep trance. So Elizabeth Clare Prophet, I was asked by Ellen to join their group, Summit Lighthouse, at that time before it became the Church Universal and Triumphant. And I said no. But, she did this whole thing with stones also, but she couldn't manifest the stones or crystals. So she would give you a little stone or crystal every time you'd come to one of her classes. And this continued until I met her many years later in Montana again, when she had created this huge worldwide church, which was all about the 7 rays, all about channeling the masters. And she would supposedly go into trance and then give messages from everyone from Mother Mary to Saint Germain to all the masters I mentioned before. None of those were real. If you looked at the content of that, it was nothing more than what Keith Reinhardt, Mark Prophet, Alice Bailey, Blavatsky, and Spalding had already done. She read them. She knew them well. I know this because I had conversations with her about it, because I was still young at that time. And I said, I've read this, and, I get certain feelings when I read things and have certain intuitions. So I'd ask her questions, and she had no answers. So essentially, this woman, Ellen Bellamy, tried to get me to join with the Summit Lighthouse, and I wouldn't do that. First off, I was still in the military, had another year to serve before I got out. I was working with the National Security Agency down in North Carolina, and I refused to do it. Then she said, well, look, we want to bring Keith Reinhardt in, and we want to bring him into the Summit Lighthouse. What do you think about this? She showed me all this stuff, and I said, well, boy, I've never seen anything like this. This is about the most unexplainable psychic phenomena I've ever seen. So she was going to approach him. So we were going to go out and meet him. And at that time, he had been harassed by King County Sheriff in Washington State near Seattle so badly that someone brought a false witness against him and charged him with the moral act of whatever, basically saying that he had had sodomy with this person who testified against him, which was found out later to be a completely false testimony. Keith Reinhardt was locked up and he was in jail for some time. Finally, after going all the way up to the high courts, they dropped the charges, but he was in there and they abused him so bad that it really messed him up. And he really wasn't able to do quite the things he did when he was a very young man. I met him in Seattle years and years later, and I sat with him a number of times and had long discussions with him. And he would basically tell me, because he said he was still somewhat clairvoyant, and he said, well, I can tell that you have these certain clairvoyant capacities, but let me tell you, Douglas, I don't have them anymore. I was too abused in the prisons. I can't do that stuff anymore, but I believe I can train you to do that. And I said, I'm not interested in doing apports. In other words, having stones and crystals pop out of my body, especially since I had known that Ellen had fake crystals.
Oh, and just to remind folks, you were the inspiration of the movie Poltergeist because of your real life experiences in this area.
Kathleen Kennedy talked with me when I worked at the Waldorf Institute and ran the bookstore. And she said that Spielberg wanted to do a movie about Blavatsky. And so I sent her a book, Somnambulism, Spiritualism, and I forget, it's a long title of Steiner's. And that is the book that Spielberg literally said on TV. I heard him say it myself twice when he was being interviewed, that the inspiration for Poltergeist came from the Austrian philosopher, Dr. Rudolf Steiner. Well, Kathleen Kennedy and I, she then knew me from that point on, and Marcia Lucas came to that same place, and I worked with her for 3 days on rewriting George Lucas's very, very bad story, Star Wars, into a fairy tale, which was then deprecated into the 9 movies that were made from it, which had no imagination. And only at the end of the 9th movie did you actually get to see where the fairy tale, which I helped Marcia Lucas write, really. Basically, I wrote the fairy tale based upon the story that George Lucas had created. Also, the Indiana Jones movies. That was all Kathleen Kennedy calling me.
Sucking your brain. That's what it was. She was sucking your brain and putting it on the movie. But we're going to talk about Marcia Lucas's recent statement that was posted on Breitbart a few days ago. But I just wanted to take that moment to connect some dots for people that have been following your story. Now, let's get back to the prophets, Clare and Mark Prophet. And where do you jump in there? At what point does Clare Prophet ask you to be her husband?
That was when they had moved to Montana, and she had this amazing community out there, and many, many followers all over the world, because she was supposedly channeling Saint Germain, Mother Mary, Jesus, El Moria, Kutumi, Dwal Kul. And by the way, Alice Bailey said that she channeled all of her works from a Tibetan master named Dwal Kul. There is no such master, and she didn't channel from anybody. She simply tapped into her higher self after reading Blavatsky. And what happens is, when you read these things and they talk about such phantasmagoria, it loosens your etheric body from your astral body, and you start to see into the astral light with your own desire. But your desire is what creates the limitation of what you're able to bring forth. Therefore, if you take apart Alice Bailey's writings, there's hardly anything in there that's new, that she didn't get from Spalding and Blavatsky. And certainly, and Reinhardt, no one can explain Reinhardt. I won't say where his stuff came from, because you don't really know. But when it comes to Elizabeth Clare Prophet, as we used to call her, Elizabeth Clear Prophet, she would give these silly little classes, because I stayed there for some time in Montana, and she actually asked me to teach some classes, and I did, and people were impressed. She was impressed. And then at the end of the class, they'd give you a little crystal or a little stone, usually just polished agates, which are worth, about $1 a piece. Later, as I was saying earlier, I went to Europe trying to figure out where Keith Reinhardt's crystals came from, and I went to the diamond cutters of Amsterdam, and I found the 3 companies that actually created these. They practice on glass, very high quality leaded glass, and they practice diamond cutting on them, grinding, as well as they hit them with a mallet and a chisel, and they showed me this process. I bought a bunch of them, and in the end, I became good friends with some of those diamond cutters, and they actually showed me into the places that they were doing this, and I was able to find that they're very cheap, and that they come in the exact boxes when they do these sets of diamonds, like all the biggest diamonds in the world, and their cuts. Well, they'll do this in all kinds of colored leaded glass, or in what looks to be, even diamonds. So poor Ellen had bought literally millions of dollars to support Keith Reinhardt. She was the one who put up the money for the filming. She sent him on world tours twice. She was the one who bought all those crystals from Arkansas. And I'd already been down in Arkansas when I was a teenager and knew those miners myself. And, it was no big deal. And yes, quartz crystals have tremendous capacities. But glass, leaded crystal, no. It's got lead in it, and it's got silica. And really, even when they're faceted, like these stones were oftentimes faceted, they really don't have spiritual capacities per se, like a normal natural quartz crystal or a ruby or a sapphire, so on and so forth. So this woman tried to get me to be the replacement for Keith Reinhardt in the Aquarian Foundation, because Ellen, the philanthropist, had been the money behind it from the early days. Because when you're really rich, then you try to figure out whether, what's going to happen after you die, because you got the money to do so. And you'll go to every psychic there is. I know I worked for a lot of the richest people in America as a reader, and they all want to know the same thing. Are they going to keep their money? Are they going to, and how long are they going to live? So Ellen was involved in the Aquarian Foundation. She was involved and knew Mark Prophet very well. Mark, as I said, had died about 2 years before I came on the scene with Ellen, and Elizabeth Clare Prophet had been with Mark since the late 60s, I believe. And Ellen could see the direction it was going, and it really didn't work out. So when I went to Montana and met Elizabeth many years later, she literally proposed to me and asked me. She said, "I will say that you are the reincarnated Countess Saint Germain if you come and work with the Church
Well,
Universal and
finally, she's
Triumphant."
telling a little truth there, right? Okay, just saying,
I wouldn't. Yeah, well,
there
Countess
are,
Saint Germain doesn't reveal himself
I
very
know
much in
that.
public.
Of course, I know that. And our friends in France actually know that too.
What is amazing to me is that people who aren't deep thinkers can be swayed by this, and then they go hook, line, and sinker. And that's the part that I never can understand. They willingly give up their disbelief so that they can have a pseudo experience through somebody else. It's nothing more than guru worship, you know?
But wait a minute. Now, let's, we know that the people in the British Pilgrims and their ilk use seances and psychism to see what's in the future or to look at the stars to know when is the best time to act. That we know. They would know that Saint Germain would likely come back to help with the Second American Revolution. Or I'm wondering, is that why Michael Flynn is saying this? Is because this is the first little step towards a general nudge towards getting people to believe that he is the reincarnation of Saint Germain and he is going to be leading the Second American Revolution?
I believe that Flim Flam Flynn would claim anything he had to get into the White House and or to get power. Because what are generals all about? Power over other people, power that is vested in them alone. This is the old Roman thing of the Caesars, that a human becomes a god. It's a bunch of nonsense. Now, even Rudolf Steiner, he was a true clairvoyant, and he proves it by creating hundreds of medicaments, by creating a new form of architecture, a new form of a dance or movement that is based upon true spiritual principles, a form of education, you name it, whatever people came and asked him to do, like Saint Germain, he was able to do it and advance that field of study further. He was asked by Moltke, the wife of one of the major generals in Germany during World War I. When that general died, his wife was an anthroposophist, and she said, there was unfinished business. And so he actually contacted that being. You can contact beings after they die, but it doesn't mean they're going to be wise, like Ramtha contacting a 10,000-year-old Atlantean. Nonsense. If you contact someone who's in the spiritual world, they no longer have will force. They are subjected to the cosmic forces, and you can find out things, which in fact I have done in a number of cases, where something unfinished, and I could tell you a few amazing stories, but I won't, because I can't say the names of these people, and anyone I'm mentioning now has passed away, and that's the only reason I'm able to talk about this now in this day, because they don't have any children, relatives. But there are many people who are filthy rich who will come and say, well, can you help me? We believe that my husband, before he died, did something with this money or these things or whatever. And yes, you can go and talk to the person who's passed over the threshold after they've gone through what's called Kamaloka, 3 days of remembering their life in reverse order. Then they go into Kamaloka, and you can contact them if you understand where they're at, what they're doing, and if they have an unfinished message. Now, there are shells, astral shells of people left behind as ghosts. And I've done a lot of work for the Catholic Church and many other organizations when there are hauntings and people are being scared, where there's poltergeist and so on and so forth. Most of the time, those are astral shells. And you can go contact the astral shell and say, you have no ego. You have no I am presence. You have no Christ presence. You need to move on because you're simply scaring these people. It is the fear of the people, of ghosts, that keeps the ghosts there. And hauntings, in the case of true hauntings, it's usually some horrifying traumatic event around death that causes that haunting, and the astral body is separated from the etheric body, and it doesn't dissolve in the way that it's supposed to, and can hang out for quite a while. I've seen many of these cases and helped resolve many of these cases. And, there's also then just general feelings that might exist in ancient buildings that kind of have the memory, the etheric memory of the people who live there. There's that kind of thing too. But all of that is, I would call, spurious. It doesn't really matter, except if it's scaring people. So when these people say they contacted these master beings, if they can't prove it by taking the body of knowledge in a specific area and moving it forward because they have the masterful insight to do so, they aren't ascended masters. They're not talking to ascended masters. Now, there are ascended masters.
But wait a minute,
before,
but you shouldn't be looking for people who can pull jewels out of their mouth. This is just straight up spiritual materialism.
Completely. And the head, as people know, I've said this before, so I guess I can say it again. I was trained by there were 3 exorcists in the old days, only 3, in America in the Catholic Church. And I was trained by Father William Bresnahoff, who was the abbot of the largest house of formation outside of Kansas City, Missouri. And I trained with him for 4 years when he was no longer the abbot. And he taught me all of these kind of things because I was born with certain clairvoyant capacities. And so we were headed to the Vatican to meet the head exorcist, who now, that particular person, comes on television and says that he carries on his belt a bag of all of the nails that supposedly nailed Jesus of Nazareth to the cross that have popped out of the mouths of people he's done exorcisms on. That is the worst form of spiritual materialism there is. And this man is so proud of it that he carries them with him and he'll take them out and show you. Okay? Well, that is the devil. That is not spiritual. And of course, we know that the Vatican has been overrun by Jesuits and that they've taken God and Christ out of the religion of Catholicism. And that's the reason I left the church. And so basically, you can manifest all kinds of weird things. You can have things pop out of the body. That's not a big deal. But it is a big deal to think that that's something spiritual, because it's actually the devil leading you in the wrong direction.
Well, it seems to me that in where we listened to General Flynn saying these things was on a piece from True News where Rick Wiles, the person who is not releasing a beautiful recording that you and Michael did on Klaus Schwab and global genocide. I don't know what Rick Wiles's problem is. I was behind the cameras and watched that filming, and it was absolutely tremendous. So anyway, he claims that he's all that for Truth News. Well, no, folks, he's not. He'll shelve the things he doesn't want you to see. But that being said, in this particular clip, he and his guest, whoever was with him, were astonished that General Flynn would have mentioned these things in front of a Christian group and never mentioned Jesus Christ.
And that he mentioned the word legion, which is usually associated with fallen angels. Lucifer and his fallen angels.
I got the distinct feeling that old Flynn boy was calling on legions of Luciferic angels to get down here and help them, because the deep state British pilgrims are in a world of hurt because patriots and people around the world have awakened, and they see what the British Imperial Empire has been doing for 200 years on humanity and where they want to take us into global genocide.
Yes, that is what is implied. And one could say that referring to the sevenfold rays is either referring to Alice Bailey and her Lucifer Publishing Company, which has the meditation room in the United Nations, or it's referring to Elizabeth Clare Prophet, who subsumed the work of Mark Prophet, who was, in fact, I understand, though I never met him, a very gifted clairvoyant. And then calling on the legions is that's a slip of tongue that Elizabeth Clare Prophet often makes. She'll call on all of the archangels. She'll call on all 7 rays, and the sevenfold ray is a phrase of hers. So is Flynn has Flynn been sucked in to the extremely shallow Summit Lighthouse, now transformed into the Church Universal and Triumphant, or was he truly a follower of Alice Bailey and the evil at 666 United Nations Plaza? I don't know, but I do know one thing: he never referred to Christ. He certainly
Well,
doesn't seem like a Christian to me.
well,
And
folks.
what's he going to do with the karma of all the people that he made sure that died or that he killed?
Oh, yeah, especially even Donald Trump, Mr. Father of the you know what. How many deaths will be in his karma a ledger because of what he's done? But now let's move over before we exit out of here and talk about an article recently that another AIMCAP brought to our attention, knowing that you would really appreciate this. Marcia Lucas speaks out about what has happened to the Star Wars franchise, and she's livid.
Well, I worked with Marcia Lucas for 3 days in Detroit at the Waldorf Institute, and this is history. It's been verified by people who were there at that time, who knew of it, and who also knew that later, prior to that, Kathleen Kennedy had called me, and I gave her the book of Steiner's that led them to do the Poltergeist movie, and then later. The Indiana Jones movies, and Kathleen Kennedy came to visit us, and I have friends who were there when she did. And so for actually, a couple years, we gave her I gave her ideas. Well, I say we because I work with a group of people. We gave her ideas, and they led to some of these things.
No, let's be clear. You sat in a room with other people, but in your modesty and humility, you always say we. But that's not the way it is. They may have offered a thing here or there, but you were driving the conversation and you drove the storyline.
Yes, because George Lucas had done American Graffiti, and Marcia Lucas was the most talented film editor in Hollywood at the time. And he, after that, was given 2 blank checks to have 2 movies produced by the same film company. And so he had a story that he'd written when he was young, and he'd tried to develop it over the years. It was really a very bad story. It was about a cowboy and his dog who went out into space, and he wanted to make basically a children's rock opera. He wanted to have a science fiction opera made for children about a cowboy carrying a sidearm with his furry dog, and there was literally no good content at all. At one point, the whole point of the movie was that he would go and get these special crystals, kyber crystals, as he called them, and that he met the girl and got the crystals, and he and his dog were happy. I mean,
Yeah,
it was
but the
so bad.
franchise is see, I remember back in graduate school and I went to go see this Star Wars thing, all right? Of course, I didn't know Douglas Gabriel, nothing of that. And came out of that movie theater and my spirit was just, I was just so astonished because what I didn't know at that time as a young woman is that you were telling a fairy tale to people that billions of people have watched that kept a spark of our spirituality intact because the globalists, as we have come to find out, were doing everything they could to extinguish that in us through our education, through our food, our diet, what's in the air. And so after coming from that movie, I was just reawakened. And I wonder how many other people were. I never got that feeling then again afterwards that I did on the first movie. And now I can't even watch them. They're all garbage. In fact, it almost seems like the movie franchise has devolved back to where George Lucas wanted it to be, nothing but a cartoon.
Well, you talk to George Lucas, and it's like talking to Elizabeth Clare Prophet. They're shallow, and they can't explain what they're saying or what they do, the sources, or how it's going to help you in your life personally. So when Marcia Lucas came, my boss, Werner Gloss, said, "Oh, I didn't tell you this, Douglas, but go out here. There's a woman here. You're going to help her with this story." So I read the story. She told me who she was. I didn't watch TV at the time or to go to movies, so I didn't know about American Graffiti. I didn't know about George Lucas. And I didn't know about her award-winning film editing, that she had created a new style of film editing that was so shocking that was one of the things that got people was Star Wars. The film editing won the Oscar. George Lucas never won any Oscars for any of the stories in Star Wars. So it's true. 2 other people were in the room, myself, and then 2 of my teachers were there who left immediately, and Marcia Lucas. We became good friends over those 3 days. Read the story and said, this is just pathetic. Here's what we need to do. We need to write a fairy tale for adults. Fairy tales should be able to be taken in by adults and children. And I suggested a person to do the music, but they went with John Williams. I suggested Philip Glass, who I knew. But then we rewrote the story using parts of it and creating a fairy tale out of it. And it was supposed to be one story that was broken into 2 parts because he had 2 contracts. And it was eventually broken into 9 parts. Well, the theme had to be a fairy tale for our age. So the character of Darth Vader was in fact depicting this evil being who is incarnated in North America now called Ahriman, according to Rudolf Steiner, half man, half machine. And this is what we're all becoming if we use our digital devices, our computers, our iPhones. They rule our life and they take over. But we are directly connected to that. We cannot just annihilate it. We have to absorb it. And that's the reason Darth Vader had to be Luke's father. And the Luke Skywalker, his name was something Planet Killer. I forget. So the main character was somebody Planet Killer. I said, no. It can be Lucas, which is light, and it can be Skywalker, which is named after Vajrayogini, or the Tibetan Dakinis and Yoginis who go through the sky by somersaulting magically through the sky, going over great distances. So then we turned his girlfriend into his sister, Princess Leia, who was supposed to be the female inspiration. And in the final movie, they finally got to the tree, that on the leaves of the tree was written the wisdom of the world. And you saw that those, actually, I think that was second last movie, that they were put into a book, and that it was a feminine matriarchal culture that had this wisdom.
Douglas, he was originally called Lucas Star Killer.
Star Killer.
Star Killer. Can you imagine that? Well, that shows you kind of the mindset where George Lucas would be. He wanted to go out and kill the stars. You wanted him to walk the stars. Correct.
And I wanted them to realize that the training of the Jedi doesn't come from people who are out there committing war, but they come from the wisdom of the feminine. And that comes from what was in many traditions called the world tree, that had wisdom written on every leaf. And so that is shown as those books, I think in the 8th movie, that Luke had on the island. But then, of course, the tree was burnt down. Well, that's absolutely crazy. That tree still exists. It's in the etheric body of each human being, and the wisdom is still there for those who wish to gain it. But Yoda was supposed to be a comic character that was just a strange little, that's the way it was in the original story of George Lucas. He was just a strange little alien that was supposed to be comic relief, who you weren't supposed to pay any attention to. But when Alex Guinness, after the first movie, found that he hated George Lucas, that he was a terrible director, producer, writer, he quit. And so they shifted all of the Jedi training over to Yoda, which then turned it into a cartoon. And then pretty soon they have Yoda wielding a lightsaber, which is insane. But in the lightsabers are those kyber crystals. Those kyber crystals are supposed to be the crystals in the pineal gland that give you your intelligence and wisdom. But all of it got twisted up, and it all got messed up. And that's the reason that Marcia Lucas said she hated it. She hated what J.J. Abrams and Kathleen Kennedy have done with the Lucas films, and that basically they tried to stretch out this fairy tale that had a lot of meaning for our modern world in it into basically an industry, and particularly a merchandising industry that has made well over $5 billion in merchandise.
And how much did you get from that, Douglas?
Nothing.
Zippity-doo-dah, just like Michael McKibben got nothing for his patent being stolen by Facebook and that other witch that looks so much like Kathleen Kennedy that works at Facebook. What's her name? Well, they look the same. Okay, now let's wrap this up, because the point is that I wanted to bring to everyone's attention is that Flynn is now calling up Summit Lighthouse in his speeches. So you're out there in the audience, you're listening to this, you need to have your armor on, because we want to know, where do you stand, Michael Flynn, with Jesus Christ? And what is your relationship to Summit Lighthouse? And what kind of religious spiritual path are you leading people to? And just who do you think you are?